people too much, especially in the gun community, oh, it was an accident. You know what? In court, that doesn't work. Doesn't work at all. Hi there, and welcome to another episode of the Guns Podcast US. Thanks again for joining us here on one of the world's biggest gun talk programs. I, of course, am your host, Brent Wheat, and I am joined by I've called you illustrious recently, and today you're my venerable co-host, Roy Huntington. Howdy, Roy.
I've been a lot of things that didn't say venerable. So.
I was going to say, I don't think either one of us would describe ourselves as venerable, but it sounds very official. So
it does.
Anyway, before we get started, of course, make sure you go to gunsmagazine.com, sign up for their newsletters, have all this gun goodness delivered directly to your inbox, and of course, gunspodcast.us. Anyway, Roy, you came up with this topic and something I'd never really considered. I knew it, but I never thought of it as like a standalone topic, and you're absolutely right. And today, we're going to talk about the old saying of why single action shooting, typically on a revolver, makes you a marksman, but double action shooting makes you a shooter. So it's a great topic, Roy, and I'm afraid a lot of folks are guilty of this. You've got a double action, so you go to the range and you cock the pistol and you fire everything single action, and that's not too bad. And then what typically happens, you go to double action and goes, well, that kind of sucks. So let's go back to single action. But what you're doing is shortchanging yourself. So you put it a little more plainly than that, Roy, right before we got started.
If you're foolish enough to think shooting your double action revolver single action in a defensive situation makes good sense, then you're an amateur. I mean, you're incompetent and you're unsafe. And so, and let the comments explode now. Yep. Although I know most people will say, well, he's right, but I'm sure some people say, well, I shoot better single action. Well, that's because you don't eever practice double action.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I shoot better single. Of course you do. Everybody does. There's not a lot of question there when, you cut that. Oh, you don't really?
I don't.
Well, no. You're like Robbie Latham. You're just different than the rest of us.
No, I mean, I only say that because I have several videos up. I'm shooting J frames and K frame Smith & Wesson revolvers at 100 yards at a target. And I shoot it all double action. I always shoot them all double action. Because with not very much practice, you can learn to stage that trigger and I am actually more accurate shooting double action than I am shooting single action.
Wow.
And I know, and there's a lot of reasons for that. We can talk about that if we want to, but I didn't mean to interrupt you there, but I just thought, the default is they think, oh, that's a lighter trigger pull, so I'll be more accurate. Well, you'll only be more accurate if you have the time to do it and you remember to press the trigger. Yeah. Because you and I have both seen people shooting single action at 10 yards at the range with double action revolvers, and it looks like they're shooting shotgun patterns.
Yeah, exactly. And I wasn't sure where to work this story in, but something from my past. You remember the old venerable Smith & Wesson 6906? Those were our first semi-autos that we were issued after we left wheel guns. And if you remember, I'll flash a picture here up on the screen. Those things were literally the size of a boat anchor. I used to call them the largest handgun in captivity. They were ginormous, and they were a first shot double action, and then they all went single action. There's still a few guns around to do that. But you know what we did, and it was high tech at the time, we practiced our presentation of thumb cocking the hammer on the way up. And you know what? Those first shots were a lot better than when we had to come out of the holster, go double action, because we weren't fighting the trigger. And then somebody pointed out, under the stress of pointing a gun at somebody, if you have to de-escalate, you had a decocking lever, but just dropping the hammer on a live round pointing at somebody, it just didn't seem like a real good idea. So that was a very short-lived phenomenon, and we went back to double action only. But you remember, do you know which one I'm talking about, Roy?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's the same. I agree with you about the description of the gun. When we transitioned to semi-autos on the San Diego Police Department in the mid-'80s, I bought a SIG P225. Because they were issuing guns like that generation Smith & Wesson autos. They were terrible, right? And sloppy triggers and a half a mile of take up before you engaged the sear. They were awful. And so I bought a SIG. And so, of course, it was double action, single action. And everybody moaned and groaned about it. They said, oh, you can't hit anything. Oh, my God. Oh, my God. Well, I did fine, because I had shot years and years and years shooting double action revolvers at PPC and stuff. And so you just stage your first shot and then you take up the slack. I mean, if anything, I didn't really like that because I didn't like the transition from, a pretty okay double action trigger pull to then suddenly you've got all the slack that you have to take up for a single action trigger pull after that. And so you're constantly having to adapt to that. I did, but I think that one or the other would have been better. And I know there were some agencies that specified double action only autos for that very reason. So, but that's not what we're talking about. It's really not.
Yeah. We're talking about a traditional, revolver typically. Let's get back to the heart of the matter, which is you are completely shortchanging yourself if you use that single action as a crutch. And, you were talking about in self-defense, I think that's an important consideration. If you want to do it when you're target shooting or hunting, okay, whatever. But don't think that automatically translates over to a self-defense situation, because as we've said countless times, as has many other people, that you don't default to you default to your lowest level of training. And if you always cock that hammer back and then let fly, like Danny Glover and what was that, Lethal Weapon, it's going to be a bad day if you actually have to jerk that hog leg or smoke wagon and go to shooting. So talk a little bit about what got you fired up on this particular topic.
Well, I've seen people do it lately, and I've seen some YouTube people who are testing double action revolvers, and they go up to a target that's 5 yards away and they cock the gun and they shoot it. I mean, it's like, I'm sorry, you're an idiot. That's not how they're intended to be used. I don't even know why they have a single action sear on a double action defensive revolver. I really don't. Yeah. People say, oh, if you have to take a precise shot, you don't have to. It's not that precise when you're shooting 5 yards away.
Yeah.
I mean, unless you're going to jackrabbit hunting at 50 yards,
Yeah.
But I think aside from the fact that it's unnecessary and inappropriate, it's dangerous and unsafe in a defensive situation. As you said, if you're out hunting, fine. Go ahead. Take your gun, put a scope on it, practice, shoot single action, concentrate, watch your trigger press. You'll probably do pretty well, right? But even in a hunting situation, you cock your gun, you aim at the deer, and the deer moves. Okay, well, now you have a cocked single action with a 2-pound trigger pull, right? And fortunately, there's probably nobody nearby that you're going to kill by accident. And have you actually trained how you lower a hammer on on a double action, single action gun with the hammer's cocked? I mean, there's things that you should probably do because it takes a relatively delicate dance of manipulation. So you have to pull the hammer back further, right, to take pressure off the sear. Then you have to pull the trigger to release the sear. Now you have to lower the hammer slowly. While you do that, you have to take your finger off the double action trigger. If you keep your finger back there, and as you lower the hammer, it slips off, the transfer bar is not in place. Transfer bar safety, which means that it'll fire if the hammer slips out of your thumb. So I don't know of anybody who practices that. I really don't. I mean, not Sam and Susie Homemaker, they manage one way or another. I've been at ranges where you hear over here, somebody goes, bang, oops, and that's usually they're standing there with their finger back on the trigger and their thumb hovering above the hammer where it just slipped off, right?
And what do they always say? It went off.
Oops. Yeah. It's okay. It's okay. It's an accident, Yeah.
Yeah.
And
lightning struck.
And what I think is that people say, oh, well, Colt single actions have a Colt 1911 style guns have single action triggers. You're exactly right. And I have held people at gunpoint with a 1911 before with the safety on, right?
Yeah.
So your thumb rests on the safety. And then if you have to go to town, the safety comes off and then you go to town. Now you have your double action Smith & Wesson favorite gun you ever had in your life, right? Which you shoot like a demon because you think you do, because you cock it all the time on the range. And when the bump at the night happens, you're standing in the hallway at night. You probably have already cocked your gun as you're walking down the hallway, and your finger's probably on the trigger. So you're 2 pounds away from some disaster or another. So now you're pointing this at the bad guy and something happens. Your dog barks, the front door slams, your finger's probably on the trigger. Bang, oops, it went off.
Yep.
Damn right it did. I mean, you were breaking every rule in the book,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
I don't mean to be ugly here, but boys and girls, this is absolutely dangerous and something you have to pay attention to. I don't mean to be preachy, but I think people buy guns. They don't get any training. They watch video games. They watch Old West movies where guys cock their single action Colts and do all that stuff, right? All that applies to a single action, Colt, for instance. All of these things apply to that, which is why we don't say don't use a single action for self-defense unless that's the last thing you have. And so they have all these things. They never get any training, and you see them. They go to the range. I've seen them here. People come over. Roy, could you show me how to shoot my new gun? So they load their fill-in-the-blank revolver, and they raise it up. And before I can even say anything, the camera comes back, right? And when you say, well, no, we have to learn how to shoot double action. Why? This otherwise has a much lighter trigger pull, right? So then we have the conversation,
Yeah.
But I mean, I don't know. This would be easy to go on for a long time. People tell me, double action is not as accurate. You're absolutely wrong. That is not the case at all.
It's not as accurate for that shooter because
right.
of what that shooter's not doing correctly.
Exactly. No, you're exactly right. And I think a little bit of skill with a double action trigger, but you could get in 2 or 3 trips to the range. You could get up to speed really well. I just taught somebody just not very long ago. He said, he was here visiting. I test fired a revolver. It was like about 10 yards, outside of my garage, right? So across the driveway there. And I shot, like a teacup sized group. All I was curious to see is if the gun was going to work. And so I was just, bang, 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 bang. And he stopped. He looked at me and his mouth was open. And I said, what? And he said, how do you do that? And I said, I thought he was talking about like, how did I get the gun to work?
Yeah.
And so I started to say, well, on this one I had to, he said, no. I mean, how did you shoot the gun like that? You were shooting double action. And I said, oh, and I explained it. And he said, well, I can't do that. And this guy's been shooting like 40 years.
Yeah.
And so
not surprised.
Yeah, no, not at all. So I cleared the gun. I loaded it up, or I cleared it. I put it in his hand. I explained double action. I explained staging. I took maybe 1 minute or 2 minutes to do that. I had him dry fire maybe 8 or 10 times. Okay, pull the trigger back. There we go. Now stop. Can you feel your pad of your finger touch on the other side? That means you're getting close to the release. Now squeeze slowly. Bing, the hammer falls. There you go. That's how you pull the double action trigger pull. So we loaded up the gun and he promptly shot, like a 6-inch group. And he looked at me, he was thunderstruck. He just said, that's the best group I've ever fired in my life shooting offhand. Yeah. He said the important thing, even single action.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Wow.
Because if you're not controlling the trigger single action,
yeah.
I mean,
yep.
It's not magic. Yeah.
Yep. 2 things I wanted to point out before we go any further. When you were talking about holding people at gunpoint, I need to acknowledge, because we'll get somebody bringing this up, that modern tactical doctrine says we don't actually hold people at gunpoint. However, having said that, I've done it many, many, many times. Roy's done it many, many more times than I have. It's how we used to do it. It was what we accepted. And I still say it probably does happen a lot. If somebody has got that gun and they go ahead and drop it and your gun's already up there, the gun tends to stay up there. But anyway, I will acknowledge that the official official doctrine is we don't hold people at gunpoint anymore, but your mileage may vary. The other thing I was going to point out, Roy, is, really this falls into the manipulation part when you're talking about getting that hammer back or dropping that hammer. When you're getting it back, if you're under a whole bunch of stress and you do that sympathetic squeeze thing where you tend to want your entire hand to close up, if you got that trigger back and you're trying to bring the hammer back, that's either not going to work, it might fire, or it might lock the gun up. So I just wanted to point out there's another reason why this is just a pretty bad idea in the grand scheme of things.
Well, and if you don't have any training, trust me, I've seen people get shot. Well, I've responded to calls where people got shot by accident. And it was people saying they're dicking around looking at guns and somebody cocks the hammer, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they're like waving the gun around. And all of a sudden they'd have that sympathetic thing. They trip and fall. They've got a grip on the gun. Bang, the gun goes off. It probably wouldn't have gone off had it been double action. So, but it goes back to, like you said, manipulation skills and training and stuff like that, which most people don't do.
Yep.
You have to be man or woman enough to get up from this show and go look in the mirror and say, do I really train with my gun?
Yeah.
And watching video games is not training with your gun. And so if you don't, and training can be as easy as finding your friend Bill, who knows more about it than you do, and just say, hey, Bill, could you help me out here? I'm struggling with some safety issues, like manipulation skills. Can you help me maybe? And then if he can, good. If he can't, find somebody who can. It's not that hard. It really isn't.
Yeah.
Any range in the entire country, if you go there, will have a board there with I do firearms training, or they may offer their own classes or something. So.
Yep. Well, and there's a lot of drills you can do. We've talked about them before, and we'll talk about them today. But before we get there, I think this is a perfect place, Roy. Walk us through a good double action trigger pull, because the whole thing of proper sight picture, alignment, follow through, grip, all those things are important, but it boils down to the trigger pull, and that's really the crux of what we're talking about today. People do a bad job of learning to shoot with that double action trigger pull. So walk me through it, since I've never fired a double action revolver before. Teach me. I'm willing to learn.
It's not magic, and it's not a mystery, and it's not hard. Okay. Actually, yesterday I broke my long tenure of shooting double action only when I'm shooting revolvers. I just did a video on a big Korth revolver, and I was shooting it 357 Magnum at 50 yards. And I shot it beforehand. I shot double action and single action. And it's got it's not a quirky double action trigger pull, but it's different from the Smith & Wessons that I shoot all the time. And so rather than taking the time to train myself up completely on it, I tried the single action. And I found I could shoot it, like 3% better, at this distance. And so, but actually that reaffirmed me, though, when I compared the two groups. I thought, well, they're essentially identical, but the single action may have had a little bit of a advantage. Okay, double action trigger pull. The hammer's at rest, right? So you get a good firm firing grip. I like to go in about at my first joint on my finger. And it's not the gun's fault if you can't do this. In other words, you can take the roughest double action trigger pull in the entire world. You can learn to shoot it okay. So anyway, first finger joint, good firm firing grip. If you're shooting two-handed, which you should be, then the classic revolver grip where you're for sake of argument, I'll say my left hand, that thumb locks over top of your right hand thumb. So now you have a good firm firing grip. And the moral of this story is now you start to stage the trigger, and all that means is that you're not pulling the trigger all the way through at once. You're staging it in various points. Smith & Wesson revolvers have two distinct clicks. So you pull the trigger back and you'll hear a first click. And that's the cylinder bolt dropping out. So now the cylinder is free to rotate. As you continue to pull, the hand will turn the cylinder, right? And then just about the time you probably will feel the pad of your finger firing, your finger, firing finger, just touch the other side of the revolver. It'll probably touch on the grip, just slightly. toward the rear of the trigger guard. And now that means that you're getting pretty close to the end of your trigger press, right? So now you essentially have a single action trigger pull now. As you continue to press, you'll hear another click. That's the click of the bolt locking back into the cylinder. Now you're pretty much there. At this point, treat it like you would any single action trigger pull. So you want to press smoothly, don't jerk, and continue to press until the sear rolls off and the hammer falls. And then you want to release the trigger all the way. Let your finger come right off the trigger, okay? Because the gun has to go all the way back. Trigger has to reset. Then you pull it back and engage. If you short stroke it, it'll lock up the action a lot of times, so you don't want to do that. Now, okay, so that's how you do it. That's the mechanics of it. When we're done here, go clear your revolver, put the ammunition in the other room, and try that on your gun. If your gun doesn't go click, click, that's okay. Your gun has whatever methodology it has to run the trigger, but you will still be able to stage the trigger. And one of the important ways to do that is by keeping track of how your finger touches on the other side of the gun. Because as soon as it touches, adjust your grip a little bit if you need to, that you're getting close. But now it just takes practice. And this is the thing I hear at this point, because I see the comments in I did a video. It's how to shoot a small frame revolver, double action. And people still comment on it constantly. The vast majority say, wow, thank you. That's exactly what I needed to know. I went to the range. I applied it. You're right. I shoot 10 times better than I've ever shot before. So it works and it's easy. But then there's other people say, if you do that, you're going to get killed, because if you take that much time to shoot double action, you're already dead, right? Probably. You are probably right. If I took that much time,
I was going to say, yeah.
Yeah. But the secret is everybody, baby steps, right? You start slowly and learn how to do that. And then, as Clint Smith always said, smooth eventually is faster. And it's the truth. I mean, I've talked to Jerry Michulik, and it looks like he is not paying any attention whatsoever. But on the contrary, every time Jerry pulls the trigger, he's staging the trigger. It's just he's very smooth and he's very fast.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. So it's one long continuous pull, but he's controlling that pull the entire time.
Yep. And you really, for maximum accuracy, you really need to be familiar with the trigger, because every gun, the trigger's a little bit different. And I was thinking as you were talking through this, if you've ever seen a professional handle a new revolver, it's a very, it's the same process no matter who's doing it. They'll look at it, go, okay. They'll check it. A lot of times they'll check it a second or third time. I always do that, because if you've ever looked at something and not seen it, you know what we're talking about. Like when you're getting ready to pull out and you suddenly realize there's a motorcycle I just looked right at and didn't register. So that whole, check the gun once, twice, thrice, as they say, and then they'll point it in a safe direction and they'll click it, usually slow, and then they'll click it 2 or 3 times faster. And what they're doing, they're feeling the trigger, but what they're trying to find is those points, like you said, Roy, where the pressure builds, where it's breaking, where the sear's ready to break, then the sear breaks, how it feels on the return, and they'll do that 2 or 3 times, and then they'll decide, okay, now I'm ready to go shoot it. And it's just that process they've learned over the years of it's very compressed in time, but it's because of hundreds of thousands of trigger pulls where you learn the different phases of that trigger. And it's hard to describe to somebody that's never really realized that. But once you get it, then you're like, okay, there and there and there. Okay. And okay, I got this. Let's try it.
Well, if you hand a newcomer or someone who's never really tried to learn a double action revolver and say, hey, pull, test the double action trigger pull. Well, they take it and they go click. They just jerk it through, right? Yeah. And that's not how you do it, right? And there are some things like, for instance, a Colt revolver tends to have what is called it's a stacking trigger. Right. So a Smith & Wesson tends to be pretty uniform across the trigger press in a double action trigger pull. It doesn't really get harder to pull toward the end. It actually gets a little easier just before let off. Colts are exactly the opposite. They're easier to press at the beginning, and then they start to stack. But a smart shooter will use that, because after you dry fire your Colt, a number of times, you will learn that, hey, it's stacked up kind of a lot now. I'm almost at the point where the gun's, the sear's going to release. And so you're still staging. And so you just pull it, it stacks, it gets harder. Maybe you're indexing your finger now. You feel your finger touch on the opposite side on the grip or something. And then you finish that trigger press just like you would with any other revolver. With Taurus, Rossi, it doesn't matter. They all will respond to being staged. And don't fight us in the comments on this. All right. I understand. I'm not telling you that to go and get in a defensive shooting and stop and say, okay, I better take my time and stage. Did I hear that first click? I'm not sure, right? No, we're not saying that, but until you understand what's going on inside of the revolver, until you pay attention to what we're saying, and that is that as you stage the trigger, these various things are happening. There's camming parts moving, springs are compressing, springs are releasing. It's a pretty complicated engineering feat to get a double action revolver to work correctly and on time, and repeatedly, and be consistent. And so you just have to learn that. You have to learn what's going on inside and learn that it's a delicate piece of machinery and has to be manipulated that way.
Yep, exactly. And for my part, I get the staging part and I do that myself. But for me, the mantra I keep telling myself is smooth, because we've all seen somebody do this and we've probably done it occasionally. Your shot, when it breaks, the gun ends up, dipping to 6 o'clock. It's because you're going to carry through that thing. And even though it may be a 10, 15 pound trigger, you're applying about 150 pounds of force. And that tends to be even worse in shooting in a high stress situation, because by gosh, you're going to make sure this trigger goes off. And when you're shooting the double action, you got to be smooth through that whole range, even though the amount of force that the trigger requires at that particular point may not be that full X number of pounds. So to me, when I pick up the trigger, I'll test it, I'll learn it, I'll understand the staging, but I also have to tell myself smoothly, not too little at first, too much at the end. And this all happens in, literally milliseconds. But that's always been my kind of mantra is be smooth, doing all those same things that Roy said. So your thoughts on that?
Well, you're exactly right. And you don't get there unless you practice, and so if you're shooting low, you're probably anticipating the shot. Maybe you're doing this double action staging. You're right at this last bit. You hear the second click. You think it's just about ready to go off. And at that point, people get anxious and they can't stand it anymore. So they hurry up that last little bit of press, which forces the barrel down. And then they curse and they say double action revolvers don't shoot. Same thing happens with single action. If you have, the only thing that's more forgiving is that it's a 2-pound trigger pull. So, if as you tense the finger a little bit because you're in a hurry, the chances are good you're going to trip the sear, right? Yeah. And I want to put things into perspective, because it's not just how to manipulate a double action revolver. It's I want to go back to that, how unsafe it is for you to cock that gun in a situation other than, from a rest in the field when you're hunting, right? Or you're at the range and for some reason you just insist that you have to cock your gun and to shoot for some reason. All right, well, that's fine. Any other time, if you have a loaded gun like that, a double action revolver, and you cock the hammer, that you're playing with fire. I was setting some coyote traps the other day, and it's a little sear mechanism, and it's almost just like the way a gun works. You compress the spring and you roll this little sear in front of a little cam. It's exactly the same. And what was funny is that, so I set this, and it was a pretty hair trigger kind of. It was a raccoon trap. And as I carried it over to put it down where I was carrying it over, I was like, eat careful, easy, gently, right? Because I don't want to go whap right in my hand. But that's what you're doing, ladies and gentlemen, when you have a cocked single action in a double action revolver. You've got a set trap that's going to go off anytime and unexpectedly.
Yeah.
Only with
And
a little more
I've,
consequence than a coon trap.
yeah. I've got to make an observation because I just saw this the other day with, I've got some, gophers, and I was setting a gopher trap, and it's got some nice big teeth, and this one, it's just a plastic mechanism. So some of them are very sticky. Some of them are hair trigger. And this one I know had a hair trigger, and I'm like, okay, ease it down. And when it went off, I think I jumped 6 feet in the air, even though I knew it wasn't going to get me, and I was ready for it to snap shut, but it sure did. So,
well, and there's also a thing with double action, single action triggers and single action revolver triggers is that even with a new gun, you can have something called push off. And that is that if you could see what a sear looks like, the single action sear on a revolver, I mean, it's literally, I don't know that it's 5,000ths, I mean, you almost can't see the sear line where it engages. And so that's why that's just a teeny tiny bit of movement to get that to drop. And if you could see that in your mind, you would realize that you really are holding a bomb, with a light trigger switch before it goes off. Yep. But because of that small sear, they have something called press off. And that is that you cock the hammer, and you've seen this. I've seen it 1,000 times working on guns. You get the gun, you clear it, you look, everything's okay. Try a double action trigger pull. That's fine. I cock the action back. You let go of the hammer falls. Right? So what's happened is the sear's worn. And I can see that. I've seen it on brand new guns, and I've seen it on old guns and everything in between. And so just because you cock the hammer on your gun and you think, okay, that's okay, it's going to hold, it could go off very easily on its own. Yeah, I mean, and if you drop it, chances are pretty good. If you drop a gun, it's going to go off. Now, if the transfer bar safety is working correctly, hopefully, as the hammer falls after hitting the ground, the trigger is forward as it moves forward, right, from bouncing off, the transfer bar will move up and prevent the gun from going off. But I don't want to trust that. I mean, that's a lot happening in just a couple of milliseconds,
Yep. So,
well, I think the average shooter really doesn't understand the mechanics of a gun. It's like a car. You put your key in the ignition, you turn the key on, and the car starts and goes, right?
Yeah.
If you turn the key on and nothing happens, it's like, well, it's broke. I mean, yeah, I'll go like, well, geez, the battery dead and all that kind of stuff. But for most people who own guns, if the gun doesn't work, it's broken. And so they don't see inside of it in their mind, they don't know what's going on. And so I think if they had any idea just how fragile what's happening, that's going on inside of there when their gun is cocked on single action, that it may be terrifying to them. I think I'm going to have to do a video on that. I'm going to get I have a microscope where I can actually take a picture of a sear, and you can see how, I mean, it's literally measured in thousandths of how much trigger movement is required to get the sear to clear so the hammer will fall.
Yeah.
And, I mean, I just see people at the range sometimes. I don't go to the range that often anymore, but, you're in an indoor range and you see these two yo-hos next door, dancing around, pointing their gun sideways and stuff. And then, so if they bring up a single action revolver and cock the gun, kind of like Old West cock it, right? And then they're sort of like waving it around, pointing and talking and all that, and the fingers on the trigger. And they don't understand the fire that they're playing with right now. They really don't. It's like if you have an M80 firework in your hand and you've lit the fuse and it's back down to that last quarter second before it explodes and you're still holding it. That's what you're doing. I mean, it's like, I don't know how else to make people understand that. And so in a controlled environment, out in the hunting field, if you've practiced shooting single action, great, have a nice time. Same thing on the range, but never, ever, ever, I can't think of a single defensive situation where you would have to cock your gun unless for some reason the double action broke.
Yeah.
Which I've never seen. So,
well, and I hate the armchair lawyers, but I could see a situation where if you cock your hammer back and something bad happens where you didn't necessarily intend to shoot the bad guy, but it happened, I could see murder charges or manslaughter at minimum. So,
absolutely. Mr. Jones, is it true that the hammer was cocked on your gun? Yeah. And it was pointing at my client? Yeah.
Did you intend to shoot my client? Well, not really.
Not really. It was an accident. Yeah. I didn't know the trigger was so light, And then then you get then you get somebody who says, they go, "Whoa, Mr. Huntington, is a double action trigger pull on a revolver, does it take more effort than a single action?" Yes, it does. Up to 14 pounds of effort. So a single action may be as little as 1.5 to 2 pounds. Yes. Yeah. Is that safe to be pointing at somebody with your finger on the trigger? No.
Not at all. Okay, this is total sidebar, total side topic. We may have to discuss it, but that's one thing people don't understand about the court system. I just realized it. People too much, especially in the gun community, it was an accident. You know what? In court, that doesn't work. Doesn't work at all. There's something called negligence. And if you were negligent, you may get in some serious trouble over it. So it's an accident. There's our show, Roy. There's no such thing as it's an accident in the shooting world. So we'll talk about that.
Can I tell a 1-minute story?
Sure.
I testified in California Superior Court as a firearms expert witness one time on a homicide trial. And it was a boyfriend, girlfriend. He was sitting in the car with her. He was showing her his new Colt Trooper revolver. He said he cocked the hammer back. It was loaded, right? There's 2 strikes. Cocked the hammer back. The hammer slipped out of his finger and the gun went off and it shot her in the head and killed her, right? Mm-hmm. Well, I had to testify to the fact that actually, because he said my finger wasn't on the trigger. And I said, no, actually the finger was on the trigger because that's what holds the transfer bar, out of the way. So
yes,
now the
Alec
hammer.
Baldwin.
Right. Yes, Alec Baldwin. And so he was eventually convicted, but that was all around single action. Had he not cocked the gun, he probably could have had his finger on the trigger in double action. Nobody would have got shot.
Exactly.
Well,
let us hear what you think. I'm sure we'll get a few breathless, upset people, but the facts is the facts, as they say. And just to reiterate, don't waste your time arguing about how a double action trigger pull, as Roy described it, is way too slow. That's not what we're saying. You don't do the Danny Glover where you rotate your neck and all that stuff. So if you learn to shoot, as Roy said, you'll be a lot better double action. And that's the only kind of concealed carry or self-defense shooting that you really need to practice. So anyway,
it's true.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say it really expands your shooting knowledge and talent and enjoyability because it's very satisfying to pick up your 4-inch K-frame Smith & Wesson revolver or fill in the blank Ruger GP100 and carefully load it and get a good firm firing grip and a good stance and a good sight picture and a double action trigger squeeze. And by the time you're done shooting 6 rounds, you see a very satisfying teacup size group at 10 yards on your target. And you know what? Not everybody can do that.
Yeah.
And so you'd be one of those people.
Yep. That's what we should all strive for. How did you do that? It's magic, young Jedi. It's purely magic. So anyway, as we mentioned at the top, make sure you stop by gunsmagazine.com for all the gun goodness we have there. You sign up for our email newsletters. Please stop by gunspodcast.us. There's a lot more stuff there that we've not covered and I like to talk about. And you got merch. And yes, Roy, you've already seen the mock-up where we've got the Lethal FUD series of t-shirts almost ready to go. So hopefully by next week that will happen. And next week, I don't know if you know this, Roy, we've got a sponsor coming on board. So we're pretty excited for that. So anyway, reach out. I I know what I wanted to say. I didn't know how to make the mouth work. Reach out on YouTube. Leave us a comment if you're listening or you just want to reach out. Email. That's editor@gunspodcast.us. And I've got a whole raft of recent emails that I'm going to have to go through here one of these days, and we'll answer those. So we at least look at all those if we don't reply every time. But that is how we keep in touch with our friends who like to watch and listen to this podcast. So anyway, let's wrap this thing up for another great episode of the Guns Podcast US. Of course, on behalf of the, what was it? The venerable Roy Huntington, my co-host. I'm, of course, Brent Wheat. This is the Guns Podcast US, and we're reminding you, get that double action, and now get out there and get shooting.